Hello, my name's Andrew Lane. I work at the Guildhall Art Gallery and London's Roman Amphitheatre, at Billingsgate Roman House and Baths, and the City of London Police Museum, all three venues of which are maintained by the City of London Corporation. And today I'm giving a talk on one of the most important public buildings in Roman London, the Amphitheatre. The full title of my talk is London's Roman Amphitheatre, Discovery, Conservation and Form. And this is one in a series of talks that explores the archaeology of Roman London, and which we've put together under the banner of Our City Together, which aims to bring cultural content online. So let me set the scene. Okay, here we have a map of the City of London, modern City of London, onto which we've transposed some of the principal Roman sites. So you may just be able to see, going around the outside of the Roman city, there's a thin purple line, and that marks where the walls of the Roman city would have gone, some parts of which, of course, you can still see today. And for today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on the northwestern corner of the Roman city, where the arrow indicates, and to the Roman Amphitheatre, which is underneath the present-day Guildhall and Guildhall Art Gallery. So let me give you some idea of the scene today. Here we have an aerial view overlooking the Guildhall Yard. In the distance, we have the new Guildhall Art Gallery. We call it the new Guildhall Art Gallery. It actually opened to the public in 1999. And on the pavement in front of the gallery, you may just be able to see on the right of the image, we've got a large curved dark line. And that marks where we think the line of the Roman arena, and the arena being the centre of the Roman amphitheatre, the arena being where all the action would have happened, where that would have continued. So from this image, we get some idea of just how big London's Roman amphitheatre would have been. It was an enormous building. And this is how we think the Roman amphitheatre would have looked. It's a wonderful reconstruction by the artist Judith Dobie, and it shows not the first Roman amphitheatre on this site, but the second Roman amphitheatre. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the chronology of the site in a few minutes' time. So, where does the story begin? I've taken the year 1985. In 1985, the City of London Corporation decided that it was going to build a purpose-built art gallery on the site that we've just been looking at. The first Guildhall Art Gallery had been in a converted court building, a Georgian building, and that had been severely damaged during the Second World War. It had been patched up afterwards, but in 1985 they decided that they were going to rebuild a purpose-built gallery on that site. Now, because the site was in the middle of the Roman city, before they could begin their work, they needed to bring in a team of archaeologists just to check that there was nothing of particular importance that was going to be destroyed by the construction of the new gallery. There have been several small-scale excavations in the vicinity of the courtyard over the years, so when the archaeologists started their work, they weren't expecting to find anything of particular interest. But lo and behold, almost straight away, they found archaeology. So digging down through the levels, they found 17th century burials. They found the remains of a medieval chapel, probably connected to the medieval Guildhall, which you can still see on one side of the courtyard. They found housing from the 11th and the 12th century. But with time running out on their excavation window, they just wanted to check that there was nothing of Roman date on the site. So they opened a series of trenches across what was a huge archaeological site, looking for anything Roman. In some of those trenches, they found nothing of particular importance, but in some of the other trenches, they were lucky enough to find sections of a substantial Roman wall. Now, I'm talking substantial. It was over 1 metre wide. It's made of Kentish ragstone and Roman tiles. So an important type of wall, but it wasn't immediately obvious to the archaeologists what they'd found. several more weeks' worth of work, and they were able to establish that the different sections of wall that they found were all built at exactly the same height, and they were all built using the same construction techniques. So that indicated that they all belonged to the same building. And the real giveaway for the archaeologists was one of these sections of wall. It was a curved section of wall. And we all know the Romans quite like things straight. They like straight lines and right angles. And when you have a curved section of wall of this size, it means you've got something important. It was only then that the archaeologists were able to announce to the press that they'd found the remains of London's Roman amphitheatre. Now, that hit the headlines. It was talked about as the most important archaeological discovery in London for over 100 years. Great news for the archaeologists, for anyone interested in history, but perhaps not such great news for the developers of the site. The remains of the amphitheatre were deemed to be of such importance that the government immediately listed or protected the site, and it meant that the whole of the interior of the art gallery, which was under construction, needed to be rearranged in order to accommodate the ruins where they'd been found. So an enormous task. Now, if I just move you onto this picture, it gives you some idea of the difficulty of the excavations. The Roman levels throughout Roman London are found about 6 or 7 metres underground, so quite deep. And on this site, there were lots of other foundations that had been dug through the Roman levels. So that's why it wasn't immediately obvious to the archaeologists exactly what they'd found. But at the end of the excavations, this is what they were left with: a series of walls, an important part of London's Roman amphitheatre. Now, I've already talked about the arena wall, the arena being where all the action happened in the Roman amphitheatre. And if you look on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see the arena wall, the curved arena wall going down. And then about halfway down, you'll see that there's 2 parallel walls that are intersecting this curved section of walls. And those are part of the walls of the eastern entrance into the amphitheatre. So one of the principal entrances. You'll also note, while I got this picture up, that on either side of the entrance, so flanking the entrance, we've got 2 small rooms. And those rooms, they have an entrance off of the entranceway, and then they have a second entrance which lets straight into the arena. And I'm going to be talking about the lower of those 2 rooms in just a few minutes' time. So, if we think about how the amphitheatre looked, if it was complete, in red and with the dark, bold black lines inside, I've marked what was discovered during the excavations associated with the Guildhall Art Gallery. So the remains of the Roman amphitheatre were discovered in 1986. But there's been 1 or 2 small-scale excavations since that date, which have revealed other small sections of the amphitheatre. And if we have a look at the arrows there, we can see that in 1999, part of what we think was the exterior wall of the amphitheatre was uncovered, and also part of a second entrance. Those pieces, they were recorded and then they've been preserved. And it's just a section within the red box that was found underneath the Guildhall Art Gallery that has been preserved for the public. Now, one thing I'm often asked is, you've got quite small sections of the Roman amphitheatre. How sure are you that your reconstructions are correct? And I think we can be fairly certain that that's the case. Amphitheatres tend to follow a fairly standard form. So although we only have comparatively small sections of it preserved, we have enough there to be able to work out the dimensions of the rest of the amphitheatre. And of course, we have lots of better preserved examples of this type of building to refer to. So I think our reconstructions are very true. And just to highlight the sections of the amphitheatre that we have within the red box, that's the bit that we have underneath the Guildhall Art Gallery, and then the arrows mark the subsequent sections that were discovered in excavations. Okay, so if you were wondering what it looks like today, here we have a view of the remains preserved beneath the Guildhall Art Gallery. And it's not a particularly good picture, but if you could imagine, we're standing in the middle of the eastern entrance, and on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, you might just be able to see sections of wall, and those are the walls that would have lined the entrance. And towards the end, you've got part of the curved wall of the arena. So an important section of the amphitheatre, and presented in a very atmospheric way. They try to give you some idea of how the rest of the amphitheatre would have looked by recreating the seating in light. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to point out three particularly interesting features in the Roman amphitheatre. And I'm going to begin with this one. It's a picture of an archaeologist working on a section of wooden drain. And when I have tours that I take around the amphitheatre, I like to point out to those people attending that drains are probably for archaeologists the most important part of London's Roman amphitheatre. And we know that when the Romans constructed the first amphitheatre on the site, which was in about AD 70, so only 20 years or so after the founding of Roman London, the first Roman amphitheatre on the site was built entirely of wood. And it was a very wet and waterlogged site. So when they built the amphitheatre, they also had to build a series of drains to take away the excess water. And we believe that there was one drain which went down the middle of the eastern entrance, right the way across the arena and probably through the entrance on the far side. And there were additional drains going around the interior of the perimeter wall. So substantial drains. And all of those drains were built of wood. And as you can imagine, wood from almost 2,000 years ago doesn't very often survive. But we have lots of really good examples within London's Roman amphitheatre. And the wood is particularly important because the wood is a great dating material. Now, in lots of sites, particularly on the continent, you'll find nice inscriptions, and those inscriptions will tell you that the emperor such and such built this building, and they will give you a nice date. So we can start to piece together the history of the structure. But we very rarely find that sort of evidence in Britain. So we're reliant on other forms of dating, such as wood. And the wood was so well preserved that they were able to study the wood and the sequence of tree rings, which is a unique sequence of tree rings. And they were able to compare that with databases that they hold for these things. And they were able to work out exactly when the trees were felled that were being used in the drains. And that's where we get this very precise date for the first Roman amphitheatre of about AD 70. If the trees are being felled at that date, they're being used shortly afterwards. But it doesn't end there, because in our history of the amphitheatre, it's the wood which really tells us the most. Because not only do we know the date of the first Roman amphitheatre, but we have repairs that have been made to the drains throughout the history of the amphitheatre. And of course, we can date the wood that's used in those repairs, so that we know that, for example, they're still repairing the drains about 250 years after the first Roman amphitheatre was built, so into the 4th century. And if they're repairing the drains, that indicates that the amphitheatre is still being maintained and used. So it's the wood which really helps us piece together the story of London's Roman amphitheatre. I should just add that we think it's used until at least the mid-4th century, then it falls into disrepair. When it falls into disrepair, we think most of the material that could be reused elsewhere was taken away and reused in Roman London. So the Romans didn't leave us with very much of London's Roman amphitheatre. Second thing I'd like to talk about, the second feature, is the small room which flanks the entrance here. So we can just see it marked with the arrow on the plan. And here we have part of the room in the picture to the left. We have an archaeologist who's sitting just within the arena itself. And just in front of her, you may see that there's a large block of carefully dressed white stone. That's Kentish rag stone. And what's really important with this stone is a series of grooves that you might just be able to see on the lower front side of this block. So I've marked them with the arrow there. There's two distinct grooves which have been cut into this stone on this side, and I think if we could look a little bit more closely at where the archaeologist is sitting, I think that her left hand is sitting within the grooves on the other side of the stone. And they are really interesting because we know from other better preserved Roman amphitheatres that they were probably used for inserting the lowest part of a wooden vertically opening trapdoor. And I've got a picture of how we think that trapdoor may have looked on the right-hand side. And this room, we think, would have been used for keeping wild animals in before they were released into the arena. And if we think about London's Roman amphitheatre, that makes sense. Anyone who's been lucky enough to visit the Colosseum in Rome or one of the well-preserved amphitheatres in the south of France or North Africa, you may have seen a series of elaborate underground passages which the Romans often built in their amphitheatres, going underneath the arena, so that during the games, all of a sudden, wild animals, gladiators, could appear as if by magic into the arena itself. Now that works somewhere that's quite dry, but in a climate like London and at a site like the one we've got here, which is quite wet and waterlogged, you dig down into the ground and it's going to flood. So that sort of system is not going to work in London. Therefore, they would need to keep their animals at ground level. So we can be fairly certain that this room was used for keeping the wild animals in. And just in case you were wondering, the room on the other side of the entrance, we have no particular evidence for what that room may have been used for, but I would like to think that the gladiators were in there before they were released into the arena. Who knows? The last feature that I'd like to talk about is the seating. So if we go back to do this reconstruction of the amphitheatre, we can see that the arena is surrounded by tiers and tiers of seating. Now, of course, the archaeologists, they didn't find very much of that seating, and this is a picture of how we think it would have looked. It's a scaffolding-like construction made of wood. So even in the second Roman amphitheatre, which was partially stone and partially brick, and it's the remains of that second Roman amphitheatre that we can see for the most part today. Even in the second Roman amphitheatre, all of the seating remained of wood. And we have the arena wall on the left side of the image, and then the seating going back. But what the archaeologists did find was not so much the seating itself, but at the bottom of the holes which the Romans had dug to put the infrastructure of the seating on, they found small wooden pads, post pads. And across the whole site, they'd found enough of these post pads to work out exactly how far back the seating would have gone in London's Roman amphitheatre. And then by looking at other better preserved Roman amphitheatres, they were able to work out that there would have been enough space for between 12 and 15 rows of seats. Now that's really interesting, because now we can start to think about the capacity of London's Roman amphitheatre. And initially we thought 12 to 15 rows of seats would give a capacity of approximately 6,000 to 7,000. But more recently, they've recalculated those figures. We're sitting our Romans just a little bit closer together, and the capacity for the amphitheatre has been up to between 7 and 10,500. So 10,500, that would make it one of the largest Roman amphitheatres in Britain. So an important building. Now, I've moved on to this picture to remind me to talk about what went on in London's Roman amphitheatre. This is my favourite piece of Romano-British pottery. It's the Colchester vase, and it's in the Castle Museum in Colchester. And it's made in this country, and we can see that it's wonderfully decorated with scenes from the amphitheatre. So we have a wild animal hunt on this side, and if we were to move it round slightly, you'd have the gladiators in action. And London's Roman Amphitheatre, we think, would have been used for all these types of activities, just probably on quite a small scale. Roman London is an important city, the most important city in the province of Britannia, but it's still quite small and quite peripheral compared to some closer to Rome. So when we think about the games that were held in this amphitheatre, it's not going to be the Hollywood blockbuster type games that we see in films. Everything that happens in London is going to be on a comparatively small scale. And we know that there tended to be a programme of events for the games. It was a big day, and in the morning you would have the wild animal hunts. Lunchtime was reserved for executions, but it's the afternoon that you really wanted to be there, because during the afternoon you would have the gladiators appearing. But London's Roman Amphitheatre, we think, probably also had a secondary use. So if we return to our map of the city, you can see the lower arrow is the amphitheatre, but the arrow towards the top of the image points to another really important Roman building, the Roman fort. And you can see the two buildings are almost adjacent. So it's very likely that the amphitheatre was used as a military parade ground as well. And one of the questions I'm often asked is, particularly amongst my younger groups when I take them around the gallery, is what else did the archaeologists find? And of course, there was a whole array of really interesting finds from the excavations. Unfortunately, for some of those groups, there was no gladiator armour, no helmets, but things like this. Hairpins and lots of pottery. Now, some of these finds are really interesting because they might give some indication to the sorts of people that may have attended the games. These hairpins, they would have been used by the Romans to keep in place their elaborate hairstyles. And they possibly indicate that, the audience within the games was male and female. We also found parts of jewellery, so the clasp of a necklace, a gold necklace with a pearl attached. So, yep, we've got items belonging to wealthy Roman ladies as well. And then, of course, we found, as you do with any excavation across the world, lots and lots of pottery. And we've got a really nice example of Samian ware, which is a typical type of Roman pottery. It's found across the Roman world, usually has this nice red colour to it, and is often decorated. And here we have a piece with two gladiators in combat. And the archaeologists analysed finds of this particular type of pottery from the amphitheatre excavations, and they found that an unusually large proportion of those finds had depictions of the games, so whether that was wild animal hunts or the gladiators. So I would like to think that, just like today, when you go to a big sporting venue or an important day out, you might want to buy a souvenir. In Roman times, it may not have been so very different. You went to the games, you wanted a souvenir, and what could be better than something practical like a bowl that was decorated with a scene from the games. So lots of wonderful finds, and we have some of those finds on display adjacent to the remains of the Roman amphitheatre. Now, I'd just like to move on to the conservation of the remains themselves. So just remind ourselves, these are the walls as they were left by the archaeologists, and they had to be incorporated within the new art gallery. How did they go about it? It really is an amazing bit of engineering, and it's something that I think the Romans would have approved of. So, our Roman walls, let's just move on here. The Roman walls were built onto naturally occurring gravel foundations. So that's what the engineers needed to think about conserving, and they came up with this ingenious solution. So the first step in the conservation process was to wrap the Roman walls in polythene, because it was really important that the walls were not allowed to dry out too quickly. So wrapping in polythene slowed down that process and meant that it could be carefully monitored. So once they were wrapped in polythene, next they built boxes around the walls, plywood boxes, and the space between the wall and the edge of the box they filled with foam to cut down any potential damage from vibrations. The next step was to conserve the foundations of the Roman walls. I should add at this point that they also built a transfer deck above the Roman ruins, and that transfer deck was where all the continuing construction process of the building of the art gallery took place from. And what they were hoping to do was to minimise the amount of vibration and therefore potential damage that there would be around the walls themselves. So all the work was done from a different platform to protect the walls. So the next step was to secure the foundations, and they carefully dug down through the gravel at a safe distance from the edge of the walls, and then they secured the edges of those cuts, as we can see here in the image. The next thing they had to do was to secure the bottom of the gravel foundations, and here's where it starts to get really ingenious. What they did is, underneath the foundations, they injected or inserted perforated scaffolding tubes, and through those tubes they inserted epoxy resin, a type of glue, and that made a secure base to the gravel foundations. So now we have the wall carefully encased and the foundations secured. The next step was to put props underneath the walls so that they can continue excavating down. And once they'd inserted the props, they also inserted lintels across, and then they bonded that section, that wall, into the main slab for the first floor basement of the Guildhall Art Gallery. And then they continued digging, so that today we have two further floors of storage space below the Roman ruins in the gallery. So the Roman ruins, they've been preserved exactly where they were found, but now they hang within the middle of the gallery. An ingenious solution. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other Roman amphitheatres in Britain. Now, the map on the right shows 11 Roman amphitheatres. They're the ones that we can be certain about. There's other structures which might not be amphitheatres, and there's other structures which may have been included or used for the games, but are not really amphitheatres as such. So possibly about 11 Roman amphitheatres, and of those, the best preserved and the ones that we know most about are the Amphitheatre at London, at Silchester in Hampshire, at Caerleon in Wales, and at Chester. So let's have a look at the plan of some of those amphitheatres. Now, any comparison or any talk about comparison with amphitheatres, we need to start with the Colosseum in Rome, because the Colosseum in Rome is the largest Roman amphitheatre. So we have a plan of the Colosseum in Rome, and all of these should be to scale on the left-hand side, and then the four on the right-hand side are the Romano-British examples of amphitheatre. And we can see that the Colosseum in Rome is without doubt the largest Roman amphitheatre in terms of its length and its width. It's twice as long as London's Roman amphitheatre and twice as wide. If we think about capacity though, London's might not be the largest Roman amphitheatre in the world, but we talked about a capacity of possibly 10,500. And we think about that capacity in terms of the population of Roman London. Now, it's always really difficult to estimate ancient populations, but we tend to think that the population of Roman London at its height may have been between 20 and 30,000. So potentially you could sit half of London's population within the amphitheatre. If we think about the Colosseum in Rome, the Colosseum in Rome we think may have had a capacity of about 50,000, but that's out of a population of possibly over 1 million. So London's Roman amphitheatre might be slightly smaller, but if we think about it in terms of the population, London's Roman amphitheatre wins hands down. Below our plan of London's Roman amphitheatre, we have that at Chester, which is of a similar size to London's Roman amphitheatre. Below that we have Caerleon, which is quite a bit smaller but very well preserved, and the last one is Silchester, and you may wonder why that one does look so small. That's because in terms of its dimensions we can only really be certain of the dimensions of the arena section of it. So again, quite a bit smaller than London's Roman amphitheatre. And in terms of construction methods, the Colosseum in Rome, it's built of stone, it's built of Roman brick. We've already seen with London's Roman amphitheatre that the first building on amphitheatre on the site is entirely of wood, and then it gets partially rebuilt in stone and brick in the early 2nd century. And it's a similar story for Silchester. We think that Silchester's first Roman amphitheatre was entirely of wood, and then it gets partially rebuilt at a later date. Caerleon is the same. The structure that we have there is partially stone, but we think that most of the seating would have been of wood. The only amphitheatre that I know of in Britain which we think was built entirely of stone is Chester's Roman amphitheatre. So that would probably be the one that most closely resembles the form of the Colosseum, but of course much smaller. So there is a very distinct type of Romano-British amphitheatre. Okay, I'd like to thank you very much for listening today. I did point out at the start that this is one of a series of talks. I believe the next one in the series is by Dr. Jane Siddle, Inspector of Ancient Monuments at Historic England. So thank you very much for listening.